know, before we launch into the actual experience, what were you thinking it was going to be like? And then please tell us what it was like.
Oh, goodness. So I had a pretty textbook pregnancy. I got pregnant without having to worry about it. Like I didn't have that bad of like any sort of pregnancy. So I was like, oh, this is going to be just textbook. I'm going to go in there. I'm going to have this child through my vagina and I'm going to be this wonderful, glorious earth mother. And I'm not going to take an epidural and I'm going to feel my body and all of this like garbage that later I was like, what was I thinking? But I really was like, it's going to be fine because I didn't have any problems during the pregnancy. Like everyone was like, your pregnancy is great, blah, blah, blah. It was my first child. I was like, of course. And I'm older. I was 39 when I gave birth. So I was expecting that. But at 40 weeks, my OBGYN was like, okay, so if it's not, let's just, you can go over there right now and just get induced. And I was like, whoa, hold the phone. I need a plan. Can we give it an extra week? I'm sure she'll come. He's like, all right, 1 week, but then that's it. I want her out. And I was like, okay, fine. So, I'm like running around the backyard. I'm like dancing. I'm doing squats. I'm like, come on, nothing. So 41 weeks, I go in, prime COVID time, July of last year. And I'm like, all right, let's induce. Let's do this. And they're like, great. Your cervix is at 0.000. And I'm like, that's fine. Let's just whatever. They're like, we're going to give you a little thing called Cytotech, which I guess is to soften the cervix. And they're like, we can do it every 6 hours or 4 hours. I can't remember. Yeah, every 6 hours, I think. I said, great. And so they started doing that. And I was like, this should work. And they came in every 6 hours and they were like, your cervix is still very closed. And I was like, well, let's open that thing up. Like, what's going on here? Doctors up in the whole like facility. Let's do this. And they're like, so they're monitoring the baby the whole time. And then they're like, let's do the Pitocin. Maybe that'll kick some things into gear. So then they gave me Pitocin, which started the contractions, which weren't horrible. So I was like, oh, I can do this. I can totally do this. I don't need an epidural. This is great. And then the baby's heart rate started to, be irregular. And the doctor was like, okay. And at this point I had been trying for like 18 hours, trying to have this baby. I was like, I do not want a C-section. I was very clear. I was like, 0 C-section. I am a woman of the earth. I will birth this child through my vagina and I am less than if I don't. This was my brain. And then they were like, okay, well, the doctor was like, well, your baby's heart rate is irregular. And the most important thing is to get your baby out safely. And I was like, that's true. He's like, so if this happens 2 more times, I'll give you 2 more times, but really 1 more time, but 2 more times, we're going to do an emergency C-section. And I was like, what? And because my husband knew that was something I really didn't want, like I was all like, keep the vernix on. Like I had this list that I had printed out that I had given to them that was like, I want the vernix, which is the skin. I want that on. I want immediate to the chest. I had all this stuff that I had read that I like needed to have. And my husband, thank God, was like, okay, so if she does have to have an emergency C-section, what would that entail? And my beautiful Scottish nurse started in her perfect brogue, like telling me what that would entail. And then all of a sudden it was like, beep, 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 the lights were on. There was like 3 people in there. They were like, and sign this piece of paper. You are going into surgery and like emergent. And I was like, what? It was terrifying because I knew that it had to happen. There was nothing I could do. But I didn't know what was happening because she was in the middle of explaining it. So as someone who really likes a plan, I just was freaking out a little bit. And so I went in and then the next thing I know, they're like, be very, very still because we're going to numb you from the waist down. And then, I'm like, they had just brought David a Salisbury steak and he's like, oh, I can't eat my steak. And they're like, get out of here. Throw him some scrubs. And then like, next thing I know, I can't feel my legs and I'm down on a table. And then 15 minutes later, I had a baby. So it went from like, it was a total of 27 hours. I tried to do it, natural. And then an hour later I had a baby. So it was a very different experience than what I had thought, but it was great hearing her cry. I was like, who cares? This is great.
That's so good to hear because I think it's something that we're going to have very often is in listeners, because this is what I hear basically from all my friends, is that you go in with a birth plan or with anything, and you kind of have to be flexible, right? Because anything can happen. And here's just one example of somebody who went in going, nope, it's going to be like this. And it was completely opposite.
Yeah, it was completely opposite. And, you know, I had been so anti, and I don't know why. And I think just because I didn't know what that entailed, and nobody ever wants to hear like emergency when you're talking about your baby. You know, like you don't want to hear that. And C-sections are very common, you know, people do them all the time, but like for some reason when it's not planned, it's like scary. And it was a little scary, but that would be I would definitely say like ask. I wish I had asked sooner. Like, hey, if I happen to have this, please tell me everything that's going to happen. Because she was going through the steps and I was like, okay, it doesn't sound so bad. But then it was like, I'm sorry, I don't get to tell you the rest. Sign this piece of paper. Goodbye.
Oh my God, how intense. How intense. What did you, what fears did you have before labor and delivery? Like, what were you most scared of? Because I have a feeling that in your head, you thought it was going to be one way, obviously, and you were scared of one thing, and then it ended up you were being scared of something completely different. I'm just curious what those fears were.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is I because I hadn't had no issues during my pregnancy, I had this preconceived notion that I was going to have this very easy delivery. And so fear wise, I wasn't afraid really of anything. I wasn't afraid of the pain. I wasn't afraid of how long it was going to take. I was most afraid that I was going to have C-section. Like I was like, that is the one thing I do not want. And I was very adamant about it. And to this day, I couldn't tell you specifically why. Like, I think it comes down to the fact that I really believed that I was like less of a mom if I didn't birth this child through my vagina, which is insane thinking. But is it common? It's good to hear that that's common.
Oh.
Because it's like, I mean, if I had been pregnant in the 1800s, me and my child would have died because my cervix did not open at all. It never opened. My mom made a hilarious joke. Well, that's because you're so old. It was rusted shut. And I'm like, Mom, not the time. Thank you. Hilarious. I think it's very funny now, but she said it when I was still like in my like hospital panties. I was like, let's like.
How sensitive. Like, no, too soon.
Too soon. But yeah, so I would have died. I would have died without an emergency C-section. And if I was in another time, so would my baby. So I'm very grateful that this modern science exists. And I also now I'm like, yes, when I have my second one, I'm just like, I choose this date, bada bing, let's get this thing out of here. It's like, I don't have to, you know, I'm not going to do VBAC. I'm 40. Like, come on, it's fine. So yeah, it's kind of, now I'm like pro C-section.
Well, what was your recovery like? Because that sounds like, yeah, if you would go through it again.
Yeah, I mean, I really love my OBGYN. So my OBGYN actually doesn't deliver anymore. So he had a partner in his office who does the deliveries, who I actually got to meet like later on in my pregnancy. But my OBGYN happened to be available that day. So he ended up coming into the OR anyway. So I had two doctors that I felt like very taken care of. And the guy that does my C-section, he just did a really good job. I don't know. I didn't have any bleeding. I didn't really have any discomfort. The biggest, I also have a very high tolerance for pain. So that's me, you know, but, I couldn't walk for about a week, but then I was fine. And I mean, couldn't walk like I would normally walk. I could walk. It was just not comfortable. But only for about a week. And the biggest thing that I had was the bandage that they used to cover my stitched area. I have very sensitive skin. And so the glue that was on the bandage, like gave me a horrible rash around the incision. But the incision itself was fine. I didn't even take my like hardcore pain meds or anything. I was breastfeeding. So I was like, if I need them, I'll take them, but I didn't need to take them. And it wasn't that bad. Honestly, I mean, talk to me when it was happening, but I remember it not being that bad, but I think that's the trick of pregnancy, right? Your brain doesn't remember how bad it is so that you have more. Otherwise, the human
Great
race would
experience,
die.
exactly.